In the spring of 1882, in a small boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, a 28-year-old woman named Eleanor Marsh sat by the window with a newspaper folded open on her lap. The light was thin and gray that day. A candle burned on the table beside her, even though it was well past 10 in the morning. Outside, the sky simply refused to offer any sun. Eleanor had been looking at the same page for nearly 20 minutes, not truly reading the words so much as letting her eyes rest on one particular column. It was nestled between an advertisement for Dr. Calloway's liver pills and a notice about a lost dog named Captain. The column was titled Matrimonial Correspondence, Gentlemen Seeking Companionship in the Western Territories. She had read it so many times she could nearly recite every line. Most of the advertisements were short, 3 or 4 lines at most. A man's age, his work, a modest description of what he had and what he hoped for, a woman of good character, a woman willing to make the journey, a woman who understood that life on the frontier asked a great deal, but that the man at the end of that journey would do his best to make it worth her while. Eleanor was a seamstress. She had been one since she was 16, when her mother died of fever, and her father remarried a woman who made it quietly clear that there was not quite enough room in the house for all of them. Eleanor had not argued. She had packed her few things, found a room at Mrs. Whitfield's boarding house, and set about building a life with her own 2 hands. For 12 years she had done exactly that. Her stitching was fine and even. Her eye for fit was sure, and the better families in Cincinnati trusted her with their daughters' coming-out dresses and their own Sunday best. She was not unhappy, but in the quietest hours of the night she had begun to admit to herself that she was terribly lonely. She had not planned to still be unmarried at 28. It had simply happened the way so many things happen when life takes its own course. The advertisement she kept returning to was different from the others. Rancher, 34, Nebraska, homesteaded 640 acres along the Platte River near Kearney, sound house with 4 rooms, cattle operation, seeking a woman of honest character, capable of frontier life, willing to correspond with a view to marriage, not interested in flattery, interested in truth. Write to James Calloway, Platte River Ranch, Kearney, Nebraska. Those 7 words were what had caught her and held her. Not interested in flattery, interested in truth. Every other notice seemed to want a performance, a cheerful smile, a graceful manner, a list of skills presented like a shop window. This one wanted something real. She did not know why it mattered so much, but it did. That same evening she wrote her letter. She did not call herself charming or gentle or particularly accomplished in the ways the advice columns said a woman should present herself. She simply told the truth. She was 28. She had been a seamstress for 12 years. She had lived on her own since she was 16. She was not fragile. She did not need constant entertainment or fine words, but she did need honesty. She suspected from his own 7 words that he might need the same. She posted the letter the next morning without reading it over again, because she knew that if she read it, she would begin to doubt and change it, and then it would no longer be true. James Calloway received her letter 12 days later. He read it at his kitchen table after supper, with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him and the low sounds of his cattle settling in the corral outside. He read it once. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a long while. Then he read it again, and then a third time. He had placed the advertisement because his mother had asked it of him on her deathbed 2 winters earlier. The ranch needed a woman in it, she had said, not a housekeeper, a woman who would turn 4 rooms and a corral into a home. He had resisted for 2 years. Then the loneliness had settled in his chest like a stone that moved when he breathed. He had received 14 letters in reply to his notice. Most of them were full of the very things he had asked women not to send. Descriptions of cooking and cleaning skills, offered like references for employment. Pretty phrases about how happy they would make him. Eleanor's letter was the only one that sounded like a real person speaking plainly across the miles. He wrote back that same night. They wrote to each other for 3 months. The letters were not short. They took an evening to write and left the writer feeling a little bare. Afterward, the way it feels when you have told someone something true and you are not yet certain they will hold it gently. James wrote about the ranch without bragging. He described the wind that came across the Nebraska plains in January and how you could hear it in the walls like a living thing, trying to find a way inside. He wrote about the prairie in late April when the grass returned, and how a man could stand in it and feel something close to hope if he let himself. He told her about the drought of 1878 that had taken his first herd, and about his dog Hector, a cattle dog who had been with him 9 years and still pretended not to care when James came home from the fields, though he was always at the door when it opened. Eleanor wrote about Cincinnati and Mrs. Whitfield's precise opinions on the proper way to store teacups. She wrote about the young widow on the 2nd floor who played the same sad song on the piano every Sunday evening. She wrote about the way the city smelled in the heat of summer, which was not pleasant but was at least known to her. She wrote about her work, about the satisfaction of making a garment that fit a person as if it had been shaped for them alone. She wrote about her father and his second wife, not with bitterness, for she had made her peace with that long ago, but plainly because James had asked, and she had decided she would answer plainly or not at all. By the end of those 3 months, they knew each other's minds and histories and fears in the way that only people who have never met can know one another. They knew the shape of each other's thoughts. They did not yet know the sound of each other's laughter, or the way the other looked when tired, or how a hand would feel in their own. They were deciding on a shared life from letters alone, and they both understood that, and neither pretended it was otherwise. James's last letter before her journey was short. "I do not know if this will work," he wrote. "I think it might. I have thought about it a great deal. I think you are the kind of person worth taking a risk on. I hope you think the same of me. The train arrives in Kearney on a Tuesday. I will be there." Eleanor boarded the westbound train from Cincinnati on a Tuesday morning in July. She had sold most of what she owned. She had given her best sewing scissors to the piano-playing widow, and a length of purple silk to Mrs. Whitfield. She had packed 2 dresses, her sewing kit, 3 books, the photograph of her mother taken before the fever, and the bundle of James Calloway's letters tied with the blue ribbon from one of her old commissions. The journey would take 3.5 days on the Union Pacific Railroad, that great line of iron and steam that had been laid across the plains and was still changing the country for everyone who traveled it. The landscape changed in ways she had not expected. Forests gave way to open farmland. Farmland gave way to something wider and flatter still. Somewhere in Illinois, the last tree she would see for many miles slipped behind the train, and she felt with a shock that she was already in a country she had never known. She was afraid. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and watched the country pass and thought of all the things that could go wrong. He could be nothing like his letters. The ranch could be a disappointment. She could step off the train and feel nothing at all, and he could look at her and feel the same. But Eleanor Marsh had learned long ago that being afraid was not the same as turning back. She had been doing hard things while afraid since she was 16. She was not about to stop now. She thought of his 7 words. Not interested in flattery, interested in truth. She thought of the letter about Hector, and how a man who noticed the small, honest things about a dog was probably the kind of man who would notice small, honest things about a wife as well. She thought of the letter where he had written about losing his herd, not with self-pity and not with showy courage, but with the plain acknowledgment of a man who had taken the blow and kept going. She thought she might already love the idea of him. Soon she would learn whether the man himself could meet that idea. One afternoon, when the train had been rolling for 2 days, and the prairie had begun to open up around them like an endless green and gold sea, Eleanor took the photograph of her mother from her bag. She held it in both hands and looked at the gentle face she remembered. The glass in the small frame was cool against her fingers. She thought of her mother's hands, the way they had guided her first stitches, the way they had cooled her forehead during the fever that finally took her. She thought of the family she had lost, and the family she was traveling toward. "I'm going to make a home, Mama," she whispered, so softly that the woman in the next seat could not hear. "The kind you would have wanted for me. I'm going to be brave the way you were." A tear slid down her cheek and fell onto the ribbon around the letters in her lap. She did not wipe it away. She simply held the photograph a little longer, then wrapped it carefully and put it back. The train kept moving west. When the train pulled into the station at Kearney, Eleanor stepped down with her trunk beside her and looked for the man she had come to meet. He was taller than she had pictured. That was the first thing she noticed. He stood with his hat held in both hands in front of him, and the posture struck her as one of genuine nervousness. It reassured her more than any smile could have. He was as uncertain as she was. That meant he was real. "Miss Marsh," he said when she reached him. "Mr. Calloway," she answered. They stood for a moment while the train released great clouds of steam behind her, and a porter called out somewhere down the platform. A dog barked in the distance. Eleanor found herself wondering if it was Hector. "Well," James said at last, "you're real." "You are too," she said. "I wasn't entirely certain until this moment." Something in his face eased then. A tightness around the eyes that she had not known was there until it loosened. "The wagon's out front," he said. "It's about an hour to the ranch. Hector is at home. He's going to pretend he doesn't care that you're there." "He'll be at the door when we arrive," Eleanor said. James looked at her with something like wonder. "He'll be at the door," he agreed. He picked up her trunk and carried it toward the wagon without asking, and she walked beside him. The afternoon light lay across the platform in long, warm bands. She thought that the man beside her carried himself like someone who had known hard things and kept moving anyway, and that she recognized that in herself. It felt like the beginning of something true. The ranch was not grand, but it was solid. The 640 acres had come to him through the Homestead Act, the law that had given so many families their first real chance at land of their own, if they were willing to work it and stay. James had worked it and stayed. He had told her the truth about the house in his letters. 4 rooms, a windmill that needed replacing, a garden that had been started and then left when the last hand went north to work on the railroad. What she had not expected was the light. In Cincinnati, the light always came filtered through something, buildings or smoke, or the general busyness of the sky. Here the light came from everywhere at once, vast and clear, and a little exposing. Standing in it that first morning, looking out across the prairie that ran to the horizon in every direction, Eleanor felt as though the sky itself were looking back at her and asking who she intended to be in this wide place. Hector was at the door when they arrived, exactly as they had said he would be. He was an old cattle dog with gray at his muzzle, and the careful dignity of an animal who had decided that age deserved a certain reserve. He looked at Eleanor with amber eyes that gave nothing away, then turned and walked back to his place beside the kitchen stove. She understood him completely and liked him at once. The first week was careful and quiet. James rose before dawn to see to the cattle. Eleanor heard him in the kitchen making coffee, while she lay in the unfamiliar room and listened to the new sounds of the house. She mended his shirts, fixed the loose hinge on the root cellar door, and reorganized the kitchen in a way that made more sense to her hands. She asked his opinion before she did it, and he seemed grateful that she had. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the sun sink through layers of gold and amber and rose until the prairie turned a soft blue-gray. The silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of 2 people who had promised each other the truth, and were now learning what that promise meant when there were no more letters to hide behind. "It's different than I imagined," she said one evening. "Too much space?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. "No," she said at last. "I think it is what I have been missing. I just didn't have a name for it until now." James was quiet for a while. "I've been thinking that this is the most I've spoken to another person in 3 years," he said. "It's strange how little I mind it." "I've been thinking that your letters were the most honest words anyone has ever sent me," Eleanor answered. and that you are more than the letters. I hoped you would be. I wasn't sure." He turned and looked at her in the fading light. She met his gaze. The prairie stretched on behind him like a promise that had not yet been broken. "I think we might be all right," he said. "I think we might be," she agreed. 3 weeks after she arrived, James proposed while they were mending fence in the north pasture. Hector lay in the grass nearby, pretending to sleep but watching them both with one eye open. James straightened up from the post he had been working on, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at her. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "If you're willing. I think we're good for each other. I think this place needs you, and I think I do too, not in a desperate way, in the way that makes a man feel more like himself when someone else is near." Eleanor stood with the wire cutters in her hand and looked at him for a long moment. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass. "Yes," she said. "That's it?" he asked, almost smiling. "That's it," she said. "You have been honest with me from the very first word. Everything has been exactly as you described it. I'm not going to need convincing." They were married the following Saturday by the circuit preacher who came through Kearney twice a month. 4 people stood with them: the preacher, the neighboring couple who had brought a pie, and Hector, who had walked in because the door was open and had placed himself directly beside Eleanor's left foot for the entire ceremony. She took that as his blessing. James slipped his mother's gold ring onto her finger. It was simple and warm from his hand. When it was done, he looked at her with the same careful, unlocked expression she had first seen on the platform. "Well, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Calloway," she answered. Hector thumped his tail once against the floor without lifting his head. In the months that followed, Eleanor began to understand that she had not crossed the country simply to become a wife. She had come to build something that belonged to both of them. James built her a small sewing room on the east side of the house, where the morning light fell exactly as it should. She planted a garden where the old one had been abandoned. By the second summer, it was feeding not only their table, but 2 neighboring families as well. People began to come from 20 and 30 miles away for Eleanor Calloway's stitching. The house that had 4 rooms slowly grew to 5, then 6, then 7, as the family they were making needed more space. If Eleanor's journey from a gray Cincinnati morning to this wide Nebraska light, or the way 2 strangers chose to build a life on nothing but honest letters and daily kindness, has touched something quiet inside you, I would be so grateful if you would like this video, and if you feel moved to share, please leave a comment with a memory of your own family. Perhaps a grandmother who made a brave choice, or a quiet moment when you realized how much your parents had given without ever speaking of it. Those stories are a kind of light for the rest of us, and I would love to read them. The years brought children, 4 in all, a son first, then a daughter, then another son, and finally a girl who looked so much like Eleanor's mother that James had to look away the first time he held her. The children learned to ride before they learned to read properly, and they grew up knowing that the prairie was both their playground and their teacher. Eleanor continued to sew, and James continued to rise before the sun. The ranch was never wealthy, but it was steady, and the land that James had claimed under the Homestead Act decades earlier had become more than acres. It had become the place where their children took their first steps, and where laughter lived in the walls, along with the sound of the wind. Then came the winter of 1886 and 1887. It would be remembered across the plains as the Great Blizzard, the winter that broke many a cattleman and sent families back east or into the towns. The snow came sideways and the wind did not stop for days. The temperature dropped so low that a man could lose the feeling in his hands before he reached the barn. James tied a rope from the house to the corral so he would not lose his way when he went out to check on the herd. One afternoon, he was gone longer than he should have been. Eleanor kept the children close to the stove and tried not to watch the window. When the door finally opened and he stumbled in with snow crusted in his beard and his eyes red from the cold, she thought her heart might stop and then start again all at once. She helped him to the chair and held his frozen hands between her own until they stopped shaking. "I lost more than half the herd," he said later, when the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet. "A lot of men are saying it's time to go, that the open range is finished." Eleanor looked at his face, the lines that the weather and the years had put there, and at the way his hand still held hers, even though he was too tired to grip tightly. "We knew the winters would be hard," she said. "You wrote it in your letters. I came anyway. I didn't know how hard it would be to face them without you here to come back to," he answered. "I kept thinking of that first letter you sent, how you said you weren't fragile. I held to that out there in the white." She leaned her head against his shoulder, "And I held to the thought that you would do everything you could to come home, because you are a man who keeps his word." They stayed. They rebuilt what they could. The children grew older and stronger, and the ranch found its footing again in the years that followed. One evening, when their oldest son was nearly 14, and the worst of the hard winters seemed to be behind them, the boy sat with Eleanor on the porch while James was still out with the cattle. The sky was the soft purple that came just before full dark. "Ma," he said after a while, "why did you come all the way out here from Ohio? Grandma and Grandpa were back there. It must have been lonely." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She thought of the gray morning in Cincinnati, the newspaper, the photograph wrapped in cloth, the blue ribbon around the letters. "I was lonely there too," she said at last. "Your father wrote me letters that felt like someone was telling the truth, instead of trying to sell me a dream. I came because I believed there might be a real life at the end of those words, and because I wanted a family of my own to love." The boy was silent. Then he reached over and took her hand, something he had not done in years. "I'm glad you came, Ma," he said. "I'm real glad." She squeezed his fingers and did not trust herself to speak for a minute. The prairie stretched out before them, the same prairie that had once felt so large and exposing, and now felt like the arms of something that had held them all these years. The children grew up, and some stayed near, and some went a little farther, but the ranch remained the place they all returned to. Eleanor's sewing room became the spot where wedding dresses and baby bonnets and Sunday shirts were made for half the county. James added on to the house whenever another grandchild needed a bed. The light never changed. It still came from everywhere at once. In the spring of 1922, 3 days after their 40th wedding anniversary, James Calloway died at the kitchen table. His coffee cup sat beside him, gone cold the way it always did when he became lost in thought. Eleanor sat with him after the doctor had come and gone, holding his hand long after there was any need to hurry. The house was quiet. The children and grandchildren would arrive soon, but for now it was only the two of them, the way it had been in the beginning. When she went through his desk later, looking for the papers that would need tending, she found a cigar box at the very back of the bottom drawer. Inside were every letter she had ever written him, tied together with the same blue ribbon she had used the day she left Cincinnati. Her first letter was on top. She took the bundle out and carried it to the kitchen table where he had always done his best thinking. She untied the ribbon with hands that trembled only a little, and read the words she had written so long ago. She could hear her own voice in them, the plain voice of a woman who had decided to tell the truth to a stranger, and had discovered she was writing to the man who would become her home. She read one of his letters then, the one where he had described the prairie in April, and the feeling of hope that could rise with the grass if a person let it. Another about Hector, who had died years earlier, but whose place by the stove had never quite been filled by any other dog. The tears came then, slow and steady, and she did not try to stop them. She simply sat with the letters in her lap and the ribbon in her hand, and understood that he had kept every word she had ever sent him all those years, through the blizzards and the good summers and the children and the quiet evenings. He had kept them because they had been true. Eleanor lived another 12 years after James. The ranch was never empty. Children and grandchildren came and went, and the sewing room stayed busy, and the prairie remained the prairie. She had once been afraid on a train heading west that the man waiting at the end of the journey might not be equal to the idea she had built from his letters. She had been wrong. He had been better than the idea. He had been real and steady and true. And in the end, that was the only kind of love worth crossing the frontier for. If this story of a woman who answered a stranger's mail order bride notice and found not only a husband, but the greatest, quietest, most enduring love of her life, has touched your heart the way it touches mine every time I think of it, I hope you will subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell so you will never miss another warm story from the American frontier. There are so many more to tell, and I am grateful to tell them with you listening.